before I begin, I want to say thanks for inviting me here. I've done research in a lot of libraries and archives around the country, and it's not just being a polite guest to say that my favorite place is the Alabama Department of Archives and History. For every project I've been involved with where I came to do research, the staff was incredibly professional and helpful. It is a real jewel for the state of Alabama, and I'm particularly conscious of this because many states, such as Georgia, South Carolina, basically are destroying their state departments of archives. So as Benjamin Franklin said about America, we have a democracy. If we can keep it, you have an archives, and a great one, and you need to work to keep it and make sure it gets the kind of support it needs and it deserves. You're a little bit of a guinea pig for me. I've talked about George Wallace a good bit. I've mentioned his inaugural speech, but until Ed asked me to talk about this, I hadn't really sat down and focused entirely on the inaugural speech, which is in some ways surprising. It is, after all, the one thing that George Wallace is most remembered for. If you go into Bartlett's, the last hardback edition of Bartlett's Familiar Quotations, and the online edition, you will see that there is one quote from George Wallace, and we all know what it is. In the name of the greatest people that ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, which of course was about 6 months, I think, but at least. Now, in some ways, it's hard to go back and remember where George Wallace was at the time that he gave this speech in January of 1963. He certainly wasn't an unknown figure, but if you judge it by the newspaper of record, the New York Times, and you go back and look, you'll see that he had relatively little national attention, some with Frank Johnson, the controversy there, but almost no national attention. He was simply one in that great caravan of Dixie demagogues, Strom Thurmond and others, and probably one of the lesser of that group. But when he won in 1962 and prepared to take his place as governor in his inaugural speech, Bill Jones was convinced, his press secretary was convinced that this could be a place in which he could make a national kind of splash, and that was certainly part of what he was aiming for. And Wallace, Governor Wallace, later Governor Wallace, did as well. And it was partly for that reason that he worked, or at least had his assistants work very hard on this speech. And Jones himself, who had established good relations with the National Press Corps, gave them an advance copy of the major networks and pointed out what he called the most noteworthy sections of the speech. And understandably, they had to do with the defense of segregation. That was what this was all about then. And as far as I can tell, the networks only filmed, they had a copy in front of them, they only filmed 2 or 3 or 4 minutes of the speech. Now we do, as some of you know, recently, several years ago, a nearly complete copy of the speech was given to the archives and is now available on YouTube. But at the time, it was simply this very, very brief section that appeared on all 3 networks, and I have actually been able to document that it was essentially the same, all 3 ran the same little segment, and you'll now hear it, just to remind you.
In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. Let us send this message back to Washington by our representatives who are here with us today, that from this day we are standing up, and the heel of tyranny does not fit the neck of an upright man, that we intend to take the offensive and carry our fight for freedom across this nation, wielding the balance of power we know we possess in the Southland, that we, not the insipid bloc voters of some sections, will determine in the next election who shall sit in the White House of these United States.
I'm sure most of you have heard at least some or all of that, probably more recently with the 50th anniversary, more than other times. And yet, it's a most unlikely journey for all of you, and many of you are familiar with the history of Governor Wallace. You know that he began first elected to the state legislature and was considered to be the most liberal of the liberals. And there weren't that many, but there were in the Alabama legislature. Was a follower, of course, and closely associated with Big Jim Folsom. And his wing of the party. He ran with the support of Folsom later on. In fact, I think was a little bit of a nuisance at times, or at least Folsom told me he was. But it's indicative of the kind of figure that he was, that Folsom later said the only thing George Wallace asked in terms of a special favor was to be named to the Board of Trustees of Tuskegee University. And he was, in fact, a very conscientious member of the board, attended all but one meeting during that time. Of course, it's difficult to know exactly the rationale, but Folsom certainly believed and was looking forward to the day when African Americans in Alabama would vote. And I think Wallace felt the same way, so why not get in on the ground floor from the very beginning there before this happens. He was elected circuit judge in 1952, noted for his fairness in dealing with black and white clients. But things, of course, began to turn in Alabama. Not so much with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, but the Autherine Lucy case. And as somebody said, the wheels fell off of any semblance of racial moderation in Alabama when that happened. In 1956, George Wallace broke with Folsom, technically on the grounds that he was a drunk, but everyone knew it was because of the racial issue. He still, however, ran as a moderate, so-called, in 1958 against John Patterson, lost. And in that famous quote, the night of the defeat, said that he had been out-niggered. He'd never be out-niggered again. He later denied this, but I talked to two people who were present, one of whom admitted with some embarrassment that was the case. And it's no accident that he immediately after that loss then turned to try to change his whole image, mainly by engaging in a confrontation with, see, get here. Is this supposed to work here? Let's see. It's supposed to. Can you hit it there to go to the next one? There we go. There we go. Judge Frank Johnson, who had been his college friend, of course, was trying to support the Justice Department getting voting records, and Wallace claimed to bar them. In fact, privately, he met with Judge Johnson and proceeded to turn over the records that were necessary. Then turned around, called a press conference, and announced that he had not done so. And as he learned at that point, what was really important was not so much what happened, but what you said happened. And if you said it vehemently and strongly enough, after a while, if people wanted to believe it, they believed it. And so he established a reputation as someone who had stood up to the federal government when in fact he had done no such thing. By the time he's running in 62, he is very much tied with the most conservative elements, racial elements within the party. He remained silent in the 58 campaign. He had spoken out against the Klan. That doesn't happen in the 62 campaign. By this time, as I said, the white supremacy campaign, the Citizens Council, this used to infuriate the Citizens Council people when you referred to them as a white Citizens Council. Technically, they were the Citizens Council, but they were always the white Citizens Council. And he began speaking at their various, this is a rally, a white Citizens Council rally in 1963. So that by the time, back up here, by the time that he's giving his inaugural speech, he clearly has made this kind of transformation. Now, as he prepares to give that inaugural speech, and even before that, he turned to a rather strange choice for a speechwriter and supporter, a man named Asa Earl Carter, who I'm going to be talking about a good bit. He was born in Anniston, Alabama, grew up there, and the eldest of 4 children, and very middle-class background. Carter is hired. Well, I say it's strange that he should be hired because by the time that the 62 campaign comes around, he's not exactly in good odor, even among segregationists in Alabama. Nevertheless, Bill Jones recognized the fact that he was a very, very good writer and someone who could be extremely helpful to them. So he was hired off the books. He wasn't officially paid. Some of Wallace's business friends arranged for him to receive a monthly stipend for doing nothing. Well, now, let me talk a little bit, and I will be talking a little bit about Carter because he plays such an important role here. As I said, he grew up in Anniston. He graduated from high school and was admitted immediately into the OCS program during World War II, 1943, and almost immediately washed out, mainly because of drinking, a problem which would be with him for the rest of his life. And he remained in the Navy throughout the rest of the war. Never rose above radio man third class. And in part, I can't prove this. In part, I believe it's because he was involved in extremely right-wing political activities. I do know that there was at one time a 63-page report compiled by Naval Intelligence during World War II. Unfortunately, in the 1960s, those were shredded. So I have no idea what's in them, but the Naval Intelligence doesn't normally accumulate a 63-page report on a radio man third class unless there's something going on, and I think I know what it was. He had come under the influence of he began reading and became a follower of a right-wing racist religious nationalist named Gerald L.K. Smith. Smith had been involved with Huey Long in the 1940s, 30s, and then had established his own organization, and as I say, it's a good description would be as a kind of right-wing, ultra-right-wing Christian nationalist, and who believed and said during the war that we should be fighting beside the Nazis. In Germany, the real danger was the communists, the Bolsheviks. He was a fanatical anti-communist, and it's clear that Carter really bought into that and became a follower, and I think that's why he was under the scrutiny of the intelligence service in the Navy. Well, he graduated. I say graduated, never really graduated, but he attended classes at the University of Colorado, became a radio announcer, and then went to work for a number of radio stations, first in Colorado, then in Mississippi. And then in 1953, he was hired here to broadcast in Alabama by the American States Rights Association, which was an Alabama-based conservative group. And he began broadcasting on WILD AM radio in Birmingham. In a very unusual kind of thing for the 1950s, his talks were syndicated to more than 20 radio stations around. They were sent around and then broadcast on radio stations around the state. And he developed something of a real following. He made up a series of liberty essays, he called them, and in fact he released the first group. He had planned on releasing 24 albums. He released the first group in 1954, and these were 7-minute sort of commentaries which are extraordinarily valuable in seeing, I think, how his ideas developed during the 1950s. Unfortunately for him, he made the mistake. It was all right to go after African Americans, but he began making veiled anti-Semitic comments like Gerald L.K. Smith. He actually was as much anti-Semitic as he was anti-black. And the Birmingham Jewish community, in a move which only reinforced his paranoia, quietly met with several leaders of the American States Rights Association and said, "Get this guy off the radio," which they did. He was fired. And then shortly afterwards was, by 1956, the Citizens Council was developing in Alabama, but it didn't have the same kind of strength that it had in Mississippi, in part because it was so restricted to the Black Belt region. And it really hadn't connected, certainly until after the Autherine-Lucy case, with working class whites in the state. So he was hired, Carter was hired to sort of connect up with what the rather semi-aristocratic members of the Citizens Council called those people who know how to fist fight and drink their way to keeping blacks under control. And he was very successful at that. He developed a following. The problem was, Asa Carter was never somebody you really controlled. At the very time he was working for the Citizens Council, he was forming his own secret Ku Klux Klan group, a very violent group, which he created by recruiting members of some of the most violent elements of the Klan in the state. He broke with the Citizens Council mainly because of the anti-Semitism, and then formed something called the North Alabama Citizens Council, but it didn't really amount to very much. He began publishing a magazine called The Southerner, another kind of extraordinary window into his thinking. Very slick. Unfortunately, this is not a, sorry, go forward here. This is not it's from a microfilm and you can't really see it. This is Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was his great hero, the Civil War general who founded the original Ku Klux Klan. And he began establishing a reputation as something of a kind of national figure. He was often quoted by newspapermen, mainly because he would say something truly outrageous. He began working with Rear Admiral John Crumlin in 1956, who I have finally been able to find that he gave him a considerable amount of money to support him after he was fired by WILD. Admiral Crumlin had been kicked out of the Navy because of his attacks on fellow officers, but by the mid-1950s, he had been a candidate against running for the United States Senate from Alabama against Lister Hill as an out-and-out anti-Semite. He was a little careful about it during the first campaign, but not in the second. So he's pretty much a fringe individual. And it wasn't just that he was a fringe individual in terms of his ideas and associations. This was a violent man. He was involved in a number of attacks on individuals, mainly working, he was very clever at this, mainly working through his various Klan groups that he created. He was not the sort of person who went out for the most part and took part himself. He was very careful. He had a couple of close associates who took care of this. But you begin to see by the mid-1950s that this is not your typical Ku Klux Klan cross burner. In the first place, this is someone who was an avid reader. Beginning in the 1950s, I found an article written by someone who owned a station that he worked at in Mississippi briefly, and he said he finally had to get rid of them because he kept letting the records keep on going or stopping or blank airtime because he had his head in a book all the time. He was always reading. And he was reading certainly not at a hyper-sophisticated level, but well before these conservative figures that emerged in the John Birch Society and other far-right groups. He was reading what we would call the Austrian School of Economics, about the relationship between totalitarianism and large government. Often he didn't read their real tomes, but he read kind of popularized versions of this. And he had begun to develop a real blend in a way that I don't know anybody else did in the mid-1950s of right-wing Christianity. He was involved in a Christian identity church in Denver as early as the 1950s. So right-wing, ultra-nationalist Christianity, traditional racism. He borrowed from everything in that. What was different, however, about Carter was that he links this up in a way that focuses upon economic ideology. He loved Ayn Rand, the fountainhead. And he created the kind of total ideology which emphasized that there was no distinction between racism and small government, because governments were by their nature totalitarian, and the need to support a kind of ultra-conservative evangelical Christianity. So, when he publishes his magazine in 1956, and I should say, I'm sorry, and of course, it's so obvious that I didn't even mention it, but he links all this to the notion of anti-communism and the dangers of Bolshevism as a worldwide communist movement. All that comes together in his writings. But when he publishes his first magazine, the most attention was almost comical, because the magazine was almost entirely devoted to, not to communism, not to classical racism. It's devoted to rock and roll. He talks about rock and roll. And most people treated this as a kind of joke. But let me read you just a little bit of his description. He has several articles in there, but he has an account of a black rock and roll band concert in the Birmingham Municipal Auditorium in January '56, and he apparently went to. Carter described how he stood near the end of one row and watched, quote, young white girls swoon to the sensuous Negro music, timed to the jungle beat, accompanied by words shocking in their filthiness. As the sweating blacks pounded their heavy beat, the white children's conversation flowed around the auditorium, filled with the coarse Negro phrases. The teenagers were white, but if one closed his eyes, the Negroid conversations would convince him otherwise. The words of these black singers were unprintable, but the entire moral structure of man, of Christianity, of spirituality, of all that the white man has built through his devotion to God, all this was snatched away as the white girls and boys were tuned to the level of the animal. On the stage and in the seats of the Birmingham Municipal Auditorium, the battle for the survival of the Anglo-Saxon race is being fought and lost. What he's doing and what he does in his magazine, The Southerner, is to try to convince not only the readers, but a larger audience, that you cannot talk in any way about communism, for example. He goes on to talk about the role of communism, without seeing this as a worldwide struggle, not simply against a Soviet-based menace, but an anti-colonial black uprising, which will inevitably lead to the domination of the white race by the colored races of the world. It's a very broad kind of ideological construct. Well, now, this is not exactly where George Wallace is coming from, but he does proceed then to prove to be a really good wordsmith at more than just talking about international communism. And when he starts writing the speeches of George Wallace, he turns out to be very good at this. What Carter has to make, Wallace has to make clear, however, is that he doesn't know who this guy is. And the reason he doesn't know who this guy is because between 1956 and 1958, and I'm not going to talk about this he's involved in a whole series of bloody escapades. His followers, Nat King Cole is performing in Birmingham before a segregated audience, and he sends out his followers to beat him up, which they do before they're arrested. He goes to Clinton, Tennessee. He gives us actually 2 speeches, and at the end of his speech, the crowd pours out and proceeds to assault a whole group of African Americans who are just hapless victims in the town. Clinton, Tennessee is one of the first Tennessee towns disintegrated. Ultimately, the school is blown up, although he's safely skedaddled away from by then. He's involved in a violent shootout in his Ku Klux Klan, one of his Ku Klux Klan meetings, in which at first they thought that he was the shooter. I'm now convinced he wasn't the shooter. This is with 2 detectives he's fighting in the middle of the Birmingham courthouse because they were trying to charge one of his supporters. So back up here. This is not exactly the kind of person you want to have on the front row of your campaign. All of this, however, didn't seem to hurt him. For example, even though he assaulted these 2 policemen, the charges were dropped. What finally did him in as a public figure was the castration of Judge Edward Aaron. Judge Edward Aaron was an itinerant house painter, black man, who was snatched from the side of the road by Carter's Klan group, taken out and castrated and left for dead. He managed to survive. And he had made a terrible mistake. He chose a black man who was unoffending as and pardon this expression, but this is what the State Law Enforcement Division investigator said. What was he doing that for? That guy was a good nigger, he said. He never bothered white people. And as a result, the state came down pretty hard. They never were able to prove that Carter was directly involved, although he was, in ordering it. It was too much. It was too much for segregationists. It was too much for the most conservative white, except for the most ultra-conservative racist. And as a result, he disappears. He tries to run for lieutenant governor, doesn't get anywhere at all. But as I said, he turns out to be a great, great writer. And that's what they wanted. That's what Wallace and his people wanted. So they proceed to get him working. I'm back up here just 1 second, sorry. When they arranged the castration of this black man, it was really directed against Fred Shuttlesworth. Shuttlesworth, as you know, his home was blown up. He was attacked on several occasions. But by the time that they had decided to go after Shuttlesworth, he was being guarded by his friends and supporters. And we know from the trial, these individuals for attacking Judge Aaron, that all they kept talking to him was, this is a lesson for Fred Shuttlesworth, because this is what's going to happen to Fred Shuttlesworth if he doesn't stop this integration business. And of course, this is the last sort of hurrah. He's been charged in the theater shooting, although eventually they stopped it, and he disappears. Wallace sort of drops off the page. Well, I'm jumping ahead here, but I think all of you know I want to emphasize this role as a writer. As you know, he ultimately goes on to write 3 novels and this fake autobiography, The Education of Little Tree. He assumes a new identity as Forrest Carter in 1970 later on. But this is still far in the future now. He's still at this point Wallace's right-hand man in terms of his writing. So what does he do when he gets ready to work on the inaugural speech? Well, the first thing that he's told is that they want something a little fiery. Well, that's not a problem. He can do something a little fiery. And he holds up and the Whitley Hotel here with a couple of cartons of, probably a couple of bottles as well, of Pall Malls were his favorite cigarette. He already had some great lines, which unfortunately Wallace wouldn't let him use in the speech. One of them was, all of you are familiar, I'm sure, with his attack on Judge Johnson, and this is a great, vicious line. Judge Frank Johnson is a scalawagon, carpetbagging, low-down liar who deserves a good barbed wire enema. Now that is, in the level of invective, that's pretty high level. But Wallace told him, we can't, it needs to be a higher tone than this. No references to barbed wire enemas in this one. So he proceeds then to write a speech, which we all think we know about. But in fact, it's a lot more complicated because the part we hear about is the segregation today, segregation tomorrow, just those few lines. And certainly that's a theme of the speech. So what I've done as part of this, my presentation today, is I've gone back and I've taken the speech, a copy of which is posted online by the archives here, and I've gone back through the works of Asa Carter and all the speeches that I have of George Wallace and some other materials as well. And I have tried to identify where that speech comes from. And although I can't be exact about it, it actually turned out not to be that difficult. Because as you start reading it, not only do you get a sense about which is authentically George Wallace just by listening to him and reading everything he's done for many years, but you also get, from reading Asa Carter, you learn what is Asa Carter. And it's clear that this is a kind of mixture in which Carter presents Wallace with a speech, and Wallace likes it. It's fiery. It's going to explode. He knows that it's a good speech, as he told Bill Jones. But it goes a little too far at places. So Governor Wallace, or Governor-elect Wallace, then proceeds to sort of draw back at certain points and to put in a kind of slight moderation that he's going to insert in these. So what I'd like to do is just to run through, if I can, here, the speech. And stop right here 1 second, if you would. What I've done is, in blue, I've color-coded this. The sections in blue, like here, are clearly George Wallace. I don't think there's any question when you read them and see what he says. And it tends to be the kind of thing that he would often do, and that is thanking profusely people who supported him and so on. And you'll see as we run through this very quickly. Keep on going here. Thanks, keep on. All right, now, keep on, okay. He thanks the people. All right, and he has a section that's clearly George Wallace that talks about the freewheeling whiskey boys. I mean, that was part of his campaign against Big Jim Folsom, because everybody knew that even though Folsom is a pretty spent force by 1962, he uses that as an attack on Folsom. I think everybody, you have to put yourself back in this time. Everybody at the time is still thinking about Folsom inviting black Congressman Adam Clayton Powell to the governor's mansion to have a drink in the 50s in the midst of the segregation crisis. And the only defense he has is that Folsom says, well, you know, they accuse me of having a scotch with Adam Clayton Powell, and everybody knows I don't drink anything but bourbon, he says. That's about the only defense that he has on the whole thing there. So it's this whole emphasis on he's going to bring honest government to Alabama. It doesn't quite work out like that, but keep on. All right, right there. Now, you get to right here, and this is clearly got input from Wallace. This is all Asa Carter. Many of the sections, go a little bit further down here, many of the sections come directly out of his magazine, The Southerner. I had hoped to be able to put them side by side and show you some of these sections. Unfortunately, it's from microfilm and it's just unviewable. I couldn't get an image that was okay. But this is all from the, straight from The Southerner. And let's give it one more. This is all straight from The Southerner. And then you get this break in it, and then Wallace comes up with his standard kind of economic emphasis upon the great wealth of Alabama and how we're going to develop all this, and there's a big future that awaits for us. This is really growing out of his long interest in promoting industrial development in Alabama. So he keeps on going with that. It's then Wallace ends. All right, right there. Beginning here, this section as well is straight out of The Southerner and straight out of another Liberty essay which he wrote. Not word for word, he paraphrases it, but it's all about the role of the federal government. And here's where I think the real unknown contribution is in this speech. It's not the segregation forever. It's not even the promise to stand in the schoolhouse door. He's been going through this before. But it is this very tightly linked ideological argument that government is inherently, the national government is inherently corrupt, is inherently evil. And it's an extreme libertarian kind of point of view that we need to basically reduce the federal government to the level in a bathtub that we can drown it, as someone, Grover Norquist, I think, said that. But it's a very sophisticated kind of early argument for what you hear from conservative think tanks today about government doesn't produce any jobs, that only job creators produce jobs, and linking it with the whole idea that government by its very nature, the national government, destroys freedom. Well, now that grows out of the Asa Carter's own hang-ups about race and other things, but he couches it in this very generic attack on government rights until he gets to a certain point here. And let me see if I've got to keep on going there. He links it, of course, like every good right-winger, he has to claim that the current government is linked to Adolf Hitler. I don't know where we'd be without Hitler to be used in all these things. Keep on going here. He finally gets down to, keep going, David, there. There it is, right there. Back up just a little bit. We get down to here, and this is, back up a little bit more, David, there, in which he starts talking about communism and mongrelization and creating a mongrel unit in the United States. And that, right there, we become a mongrel unit. This is all, he has an earlier discussion of what happened recently in the Congo, in which white women were raped as part of the uprising against the Belgian government. And so it's an attempt then to link back to this broader theme that I talked about, the rise of worldwide communism and its role in the colonial, anti-colonial struggle there. Well, now, he does this. He has this in the speech. And move it up a little bit, David. And then back up just a little bit here. Okay. And then Wallace apparently realizes, you know, this is a little tight here. And so he proceeds then to give what has been a lot, he uses exactly the same phrases in his 1958 campaign about we need to help the Negro citizens to work under the stance of segregation, but we need to help them work so that they can develop within their separate stations there. And then you get back, this is straight out of about the danger, and basically we're not going to allow them to embrace these communist ideas, of which integration is one. Oh, and then he goes through a long history. Again, this is straight out of the Southerner, about the oppression that white Southerners have had at the hands of the national government. And keep on going here. Okay, now he gets to the end. And again, this is something that I have seen Wallace give several times before, and I don't think it comes from Asa Carter. You can see the break actually in the type of the speech itself, and then keep on going there, David, there. And this is my favorite. At the end of it, this is where it originally ended. And then he asked for a blessing on both white and black. So you can see how Wallace, in a sense, is trying to set up this talk in such a way that it'll get him a tremendous amount of attention. But he is very aware that there is a limit to how far you can go. And he was right. Fortunately, most people did not remember the exact details. They don't remember this bringing up of mongrelization and the mongrel unit. They don't remember exactly the most explicit racism. But that speech turns out to be a kind of ultimate Achilles heel for Wallace, because it establishes him as, no matter how he twists later on, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, a picture and a few words are worth even more. And that segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever is fixed in the minds of the American people in a way that will always, it'll give him tremendous power within the state of Alabama, but it will always limit him as a national figure. Thank you very much, David.
We now have time for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand and I will hand you the microphone. Please speak right into the microphone so that those attending in the other auditorium can hear, and it will be recorded. First question.
Dr. Carter, you mentioned Bedford Forest, whom you referred to as the founder of the Klan. I don't know whether you're familiar with, to me I see some strange parallels between him and Wallace, in that in the last few years of his life, once he became president of a railroad, the Forest blossomed out as a Southern moderate. Right. Offering to lead troops to exterminate the Klan. And it seems he apparently succeeded in alienating many of his old Klan associates, but I'm not sure he won over any of the people he was trying to reach.
Well, it's an interesting way in which all of us, we remember things the way we want to remember. It's kind of hard, I think, for Nathan Bedford Forrest to avoid the association he has with the establishment of the Ku Klux Klan. But his argument always was that it got out of hand, that it was not meant to be a violent organization. Same thing with Wallace. He goes back and talks about this speech, but never as something he's proud of, in part because I think he wants to remember it in a different way after that. Yeah, time changes, and time means that you need to change your way of remembering the past. Yeah.
Dr. Carter, 1963 was a big year in Alabama history, many events that year with Wallace. In an academic argument, where would Alabama be today without George Wallace having been here?
Oh boy. I'm gonna beg off on that. I mean, I don't know exactly how you weigh the negatives and the positives. I mean, my own personal view, and it is purely a personal view, is that the negatives outweigh the positives. I mean, there certainly were, and this is one of the great ironies of having Asa Carter write your speech. George Wallace loved government. He loved the federal government until the racial issue came along and white voters in the South became anti-government, whereas Asa Carter was an absolute doctrinaire libertarian who hated government. He really hated state government too. And so you got this kind of uneasy thing going on between the two of them. But back to your question about his contributions, there were many things that Wallace did for the state, but I think it was always flawed, in part by the corruption that was involved, and there was a fair amount of that. As his old aide Seymour Trammell talked about at some length, very frankly, and I think that that whole turning of almost every issue into a political issue, the advantage to the Wallace efforts, probably hurt the state. But I'll let somebody else do the demerits. Yes.
Following John Patterson, if it hadn't been Wallace at that time, would it have been somebody else?
Well, I mean, there were people like Ryan de Graffenried and others that might have squeaked through, might have turned out to be someone like the more moderate governors who were elected in other states, and I think it would have been much better for the state if they had. Yeah.
Dan, I'd like to acknowledge on behalf of all of us in the archives that the reason the archives has the copy of that video is because Ray Jones, who's here today, helped preserve it and gave it to the archives, and we're all in his debt. I don't think it would be here.
If I had known where that was 15 years ago, we would have really hounded you when we were working on the Wallace film, because we looked for that thing everywhere.
Well, do you think Wallace could have won the governorship without this strong racial rhetoric?
In '62, yeah,
Yes.
I think he could have.
So what placed that seed in his mind that he had to do that?
Well, defeat in 1958 was really traumatic for Governor Wallace, and I think he never was satisfied, even when he was clearly going to be winning. He was always uneasy until the last vote was counted, and I don't think he was taking any chances in 1960 and 1962 campaign. The other part, and we have to remember, is that political figures, while they may have their fingers to the wind, they get caught up in the passions as well. And it's difficult for us to think back and put ourselves back in what it was like in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. And so even though Governor Wallace had been very much a racial moderate in his early life, early political career, it was always within the system of segregation. And when black people began demanding rights, I don't think there's any question that he had this visceral response, this anger and frustration. I've been good to these people. I've always tried to help black folks. And what are they doing demanding all these rights? And I think he incorporated a lot of these emotions and ideas in '62.
Dr. Carter, that sounds a bit like Nixon, doesn't it?
Well,
He would certainly had an easy path, I would think, for re-election.
Yeah.
And not what he took.
in
He may not have
'68, yeah, against
72.
I'm 72 against George McGovern. Yeah, it's hard for a politician to be convinced that he's, well, some politicians recently have been convinced they're going to win when they weren't, but it's hard generally to be able to do that, to be absolutely sure there. The main thing though is I'm not a cynic at all about it, but I think it's unreasonable to really expect politicians, for the most part, there are a few that stand out, but for the most part, their job, as they see it, is to represent the people. And in the case of George Wallace in 1962, the white people, he was representing them fully. And you can usually go through the mental gymnastics of convincing yourself you're doing the right thing. I mean, nobody sets out to do the wrong thing, at least they don't acknowledge it to themselves.
Dr. Carter, actually, you were a very young man when this occurred, and I wonder what your personal memories are of the speech, as you might have heard it reported, and why did you choose to focus your historical review and research in this area, because you are the consummate historian on this area, and I'd like to hear your personal thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, I've actually written about this some, but I grew up in eastern South Carolina. But by 1960, even though I had a very traditional kinds of thinking, I'm sure, I worked as a newspaper reporter for a couple of years. And by 1960, my views had changed completely on race. You know, when you're 20 years old and you're a college student, if you don't rebel against ideas a little bit, there's probably something wrong with you. And by 60 and 61, 62, I certainly wasn't directly involved in the civil rights movement, but I was on the edge of it at all times. And many of my friends, like John, that's when I first met and got to know John Lewis and others. And so that at the time this takes place in 1962 and 63, I was horrified. I mean, to me, I was at Wisconsin at the time, but it just represented the worst aspects of my history, my past. And I certainly didn't set out at that point to say, well, I'm gonna write how horrible this whole history is. But I think that was in the back of my mind as I set out to write and study and teach about American history and the history of the South.
Do we have another question?
You mentioned twice the Lucy case, and I'm not at all familiar with that. Could you briefly explain
What's this? The
Lucy case?
Oh, I'm sorry. Authoring Lucy was actually the first, you know, we think about standing in the schoolhouse door and so on, but Authoring Lucy was admitted to the University of Alabama under federal court order in 1956, and eventually a mob drove her off the campus, and then because she made a few injudicious statements, the university used that as an excuse to expel her, and the courts backed them up. And so basically it disappeared. I mean, that it didn't last, the integration of the university, but it clearly aroused the fears. I mean, up until that time, I think there was a certain kind of, I don't know, not confidence exactly, but a belief that, well, it's not going to really happen, or it won't happen in a lifetime, or 10 years or 15 years. We're not going to integrate in Alabama. And then suddenly there's Authoring Lucy at the University of Alabama. And it was, I believe, I'm really not. We have someone here who's a lot more knowledgeable about Alabama history than I am, but I just sense, just reading the daily newspapers in 56 and 57 and 58, which I did most of them, you see a real shift in mood taking place, and it's what leads to the rise of the Citizens Council and so on. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
As a relatively insignificant footnote to your topic, whatever happened with Asa Carter and who financed or promoted his books, and what?
You mean as Forrest Carter?
Yeah, and whatever, and how does someone like that write literature?
Oh gosh, we'd be here a long time. All of you know Forrest Carter was his joke on what he called the Yankee liberals. He renamed himself after Nathan Bedford Forrest as Forrest Carter, the founder of the original Ku Klux Klan. It was kind of his way of thumbing his nose. I mean, he goes on. In part, it's the strangest thing. Wayne Greenhalgh wrote a very early story pointing out that who he was, but it was like it disappeared. It's like we have this historical memory that doesn't last very long. It was gone. And he kept up this pretense through the 70s that he was Forrest Carter. Gave talks, was on national television, and published all these books. I mean, The Education of Little Tree came out the year that he died, and in 1977. But back to your question about the educational little tree, it's, how do I say this? It's an act of, on one level, pure cynicism. I mean, what he set out to do was to write a book that would sell, and he thought this would be he thought people were really into Native Americans, and this would be a thing. And he liked to talk about. He liked to talk about Native Americans. He drew a sharp distinction between African Americans and Native Americans. Native Americans were noble, independent. Black Americans were subservient, naturally slave-like. So it's not surprising that he chose an Indian persona, and for a lot of other reasons as well that I hope to talk about someday. But in writing the book, you can't get around the fact, I think, that at least on some level it's cynical. Because someone says, well, I mean, sure, he changed his mind. Well, he didn't. A week before he dies, he's in a restaurant in Abilene, Texas, and when a black couple comes in, he begins screaming and yelling that he's not sitting there and eating in a restaurant with a nigger, gets up and walks out. So don't tell me that he had this life change. He didn't. So I just have to say that there's always a gap between a writer and what a writer says, you know, when he puts his pen to paper or the computer. And I think in the case of his case, he wanted to write a book that would sell. He had a good idea about how to do it. And the amazing thing is that it had such an enormous appeal to people whose political philosophy was 180 degrees different from his. Yeah.
That's all the time that we have for questions, but Dr. Carter will be here for a few minutes if you would like to speak with him and turn in your evaluation forms. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Dr. Carter.